part of me thinks that I'm going to regret putting this one up, but we'll see how it goes. So, despite my better judgment, I want to circle back around and talk once again about the Doctor Who episode Rosa. Series 11, episode 3, aired this past Sunday. And I want to talk about it for a couple of reasons. Well, one reason overall, and then I'll basically explain that, which is that I was more or less fine with it on initial viewing, and having now taken a day or so to think on it more, I'm finding I'm having increasing issues with it, and I kind of want to talk about those and where I'm coming at with this, and we'll see if it makes any sense to anybody else. So before I get into any of this, one thing I want to make as clear as I possibly can. If you liked this episode, if you loved this episode, if this episode was uplifting for you, if you found it touching, if it moved you, wonderful. That is fantastic. And I know some people had that response. I saw it on Twitter. I saw it in my comment section. Wonderful. The problems that I have with this episode that I'm going to be detailing are the problems that I have with this episode. I am not trying to project these out to you. Nothing that I talk about here should be interpreted as, therefore, because of this, you shouldn't like it. No. Like it. Love it. Get more out of it than I did. That's fantastic. I do not wish nor ever seek to take that away from anybody. Nobody's wrong for liking this episode. And then, also before I get into it, the other thing I'm going to mention is I'm gonna kind of reverse my one, well, not my one, but one of my more notable criticisms, or at least things that I wasn't so sure about when I did my original review, which was the villain. He appeared, for all intents and purposes, just to be a racist with a bit of tech. And having thought on that more, I actually really like that. I like that that no matter where he comes from, whether it's far in the future, no matter what, that these problems don't suddenly vanish just because society as a whole may have gotten better. So I like it for that reason. There was somebody in the comments was like, we don't get an explanation of his racism, and I actually thought about that and I'm like, well, we shouldn't. Like that's a classic mistake that so many films and shows do, which is to try and explain and quantify racism as if it's a logical response. Like, oh, he's racist because he blames black people for this specifically, but people don't, to paraphrase something Lindsay Ellis says, people don't logic themselves racist. It's not a logical response. It's something that a lot of people have to varying degrees, but it's an emotional response. It's not a logical one. So seeking an explanation as to why he's racist, it kind of defeats the point. He is, and that's what matters as far as the story goes. So the few issues that I had with him as a villain, I'm actually going to take off the table. I'm not even going to talk about that. My issues are actually kind of something that I was a bit more praising of originally, which is the actual depiction of Rosa Parks and of how all that plays out. So this, I'm going to give fair warning right now. I tried very, very hard not to get political on this channel. I feel in many ways this isn't the place for it. I don't like alienating people, and this, I was going to say this isn't my soapbox. It is insofar as it's my channel. I can talk about what I want, but I didn't start this channel with the intention of it being that. But while I'm going to try and keep it with a pretty narrow focus, this is going to be probably the most directly politically minded thing that I'm going to have put out thus far. Because I don't actually consider my LGBTQ stuff normally to be especially political in nature. It's me talking about representation. But this one's going to get a little bit more into actual politics. And if you don't want to hear that, if you either don't care what my politics are or you have no interest in them, cool, check out. No hard feelings. But that's your warning. From here on out, this is my show. So let's start by me explaining the mindset at which I'm coming at this from, because I will be very frank and say that mindset has a pretty big influence over what I'm going to talk about. So if you either didn't already know or what have you, I have a fluid sense of gender that puts me as part of the LGBTQ plus community. Generally, I consider myself queer. It is a gender variant. So some people use transgender as, a very specific term. It's meant to be an umbrella. So you can consider that I fall under that as well. So the headspace that I'm coming at this from is that earlier in the day, on the same day this episode aired, the news broke that the Trump administration is making moves in federal guidelines and for the purposes of federal enforcement, is seeking to define gender rigidly as an immutable element which is assigned at birth, and no matter what you do, it does not change, which means that if this happens, and there's no reason that it shouldn't, this isn't something that gets voted on, this is something he's just planning to do, or his administration is. What it means is that even someone who has gone through years of hormone therapy, even someone who has had a full surgical sexual reassignment, would still be considered by the federal government to be the gender that they were assigned at birth. And it's erasure. There is no other word. It is literal erasure of people's identities. And, people can quibble about what does or doesn't qualify as transgender, and people can argue over people who have had no hormones and no surgery who still identify as a gender other than they were born into, and you can have your arguments over that. But this is massive. This is sweeping. This is not exceptions. Basically, unless you can prove on a DNA level that you are something other than what you were born as, which that's rare, they don't care. So what does that have to do with Rosa, with this episode, with this story that's being told? Well, I will tie it in more specifically in a little bit, but I want to single out two things that bothered me on seeing them initially, and it took more time, more thought to figure out why. So the first is, there's the conversation between Yaz and Ryan, which actually takes place on the TARDIS, I believe. And where, they talk about Rosa Parks, what she goes through, and it gets said, and 50 years later, there was a black president. And in that same conversation, there is a very quickly mentioned and then moved on from line that Ryan has about getting stopped more than his mates. But the fact that it then moves on to, and then America would go and elect a black president and kind of stops there, that's troubling to me. Now, that's not me saying that the show should have called out Trump by name. Actually, I think that would have been a terrible idea. But what I mean is, if you are looking at the track record for civil rights and the push for equality and the measures being put in place to attempt to equalize things, whether it be by race or anything else, but even certainly specifically with race, things have backslid since, post Obama's presidency. So, the elements of the Voting Rights Act have been rolled back. There's voter disenfranchisement issues and, things being worked through the courts because of the ways in which voter rolls are being purged appear to be very targeted and all these sorts of things. So to say that however many years later Obama gets elected president and then to stop there, it feeds into the very worrying perception and narrative that, well, we elected a black man, racism's over, which is ridiculous. But it's, I honestly would have not singled out this moment at all if they hadn't mentioned that, Obama's election later on. I feel like mentioning that and then failing to say, but the fight's on, like actively point out, but the struggle doesn't end. Something that feels like a cop-out. But the thing I really want to focus on is the scene, the big scene on the bus, where the doctor and her companions have to watch this happen, but they can't step in. Now, I understand, well, first of all, I understand a lot of people really like the scene. And again, I am not trying to take that away from you. And I understand the thinking behind this, behind putting them there, making this as real as possible for them, so there's as proper an appreciation that these characters can get for what it was that happened and what it was that went down. But here's the problem. It creates a scenario that subtextually is saying these downtrodden people have to stand up for themselves and you have to let them. Don't help. And that is not a conscious message of this episode. I do not believe that for even a second do I think that. But I think it's a case where they didn't follow through the implications of what they were doing, which is something that I run into from time to time talking about LGBTQ plus representation. Because I said in my previous review that I was quite impressed that they didn't fall into what would have been the obvious pit of the Doctor and the companions actively pushing Rose. In some way, they get to claim some level of the accomplishment, some level of responsibility for what Rosa Parks did, either by pushing her as a person to ensure that, they manipulate time and the circumstances to make sure that it happens, but they don't do anything to her. They don't do anything to give her an extra motivation. She doesn't get a pep talk from people from the future. They don't give her directly as a character a nudge. None of that, because that would have been what I'm about to talk about. That would have been even worse, because that would have been removing her agency, the agency of a real, true historical person who did something significant that helped move forward some very important things. So that would have been absolutely the worst thing. So they were right to avoid that. But the upshot of what they've done instead leaves a situation where the people who aren't the oppressed don't step in and help. They just watch. And they pull for the team to get there. So the reason I talked about what is going on with the Trump administration and definition of gender as being a rigidly defined thing is because I don't want to be quietly rooted for from the sidelines. I want myself and people who are, and honestly, I'm not even the most directly impacted by this. There are people I know a hell of a lot more potentially directly impacted by this. I want them to have people actively fighting at their side, standing up next to them saying, no, this is not okay. And obviously this show could not possibly know the context under which I personally was viewing it. They're not responsible for that. But I think, and as I said, having them get actively involved in the scene in such a way that it actually alters the history of the actual event would have been worse. So what am I actually saying? I think what I'm saying is that Doctor Who, as a show, as it currently exists, was not equipped to tell a story like this. I think in 48 minutes, with the way this show, with the tools at its disposal, I think it would have been better not to try and tell this story. And that's not me saying that certain writers shouldn't write things. I've talked about that before. Anybody can write anything. And for the restrictions that they had, I think they did, about as good a job as could be done, but that's kind of my point. For what they were trying to do, I do think the resulting episode is about as good as it was going to get. But I'm personally, right now, just in a place where good enough isn't good enough. So I think that there's a reason that, by and large, when science fiction and fantasy stories choose to tackle heavier elements like racism, that they generally do it allegorically. They do it through aliens. They do it through, machines. They do it, through something that is applicable but does not have to be a one-to-one allegory, because when you tackle it directly, it gets so complicated that, and because you're dealing with real history, you don't get to throw your hands up and go, look, it's just a show, just watch it. Well, no, you're depicting reality. You're depicting a real moment, and a real moment that matters. You're acknowledging that everything about this episode says that this matters, and that the people who made the show understand that this matters. But the show is not equipped to be able to properly give all the layers and all the nuance and all the context for this to work and not in some way undermine some element of it. And because, like I said, I think for these sorts of stories, Allegory works so much better. People can say that they disliked Oxygen because of how on the nose it got with, its anti-capitalism thing. Fine, but think of how much worse that would have been if the Doctor had basically tried to tell if Doctor Who had tried to tell some version of that story in the middle of the housing crunch or the 1929 stock market crash. How much more cringy would that have been? Science fiction can be great and wonderful for telling these sorts of allegorical stories, but it needs to be an allegory, because you are introducing fantastical elements into something that, this isn't Queen Victoria. This isn't a long ago and far away thing. This is very reflective of what is being dealt with now. And I don't think the show was equipped to deal with it. And I think it probably would have been better if they hadn't. So I think I will wrap it up on that note. Like I said, I'm sorry if this got overindulgent, like in terms of just being an outlet for my ramblings. I mean, it often is, but usually it's my geeky ramblings. This was, like I said, more political than I usually like to get. But if you have listened all the way through, I appreciate it. Thank you. If you are, or you know anyone who is affected by what is going on, know that you are loved and you are valid. And one last final thought, don't tell me that I can't be imposing the political reality of America onto a British show because it's a British show telling a piece of American history that is relevant to what's going on with politics right now in America. The show opened this can of worms. I just dumped the worms all over the table. But let's bring it back on a positive note. I'm sad and I'm frustrated. I'm kind of infuriated, but I'm also okay. Not everybody is. So if you know anyone who needs help and needs reassurance, let them know that you are there for them, because believe me, they really need it right now. They don't need you to stand at the sideline and watch and hope. They need you right there, actively supporting them, actively fighting for them. So please do that. And if you need that, I hope you have it. So there's the links and whatever down below. Whatever, check them out if you want, if you feel like it. Keep comments respectful if you leave them. And whatever your thoughts are, drop it down in the comments and let's talk about it. Because you are the council. And I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.